The taste of victory, they say, flows sweetest from the mouth of a conquered river. But Holden Baxter would never walk to claim it. Thunder rolled across the Virginia countryside that September morning in 1864, though no storm clouds darkened the sky. The sound came from cannons, from the clash of steel on steel, from 10,000 voices crying out in languages of war that no mother ever taught. Holden pressed his face deeper into the mud of Cemetery Ridge, his rifle barrel still smoking from the last volley, and tried not to think about the silence where his legs should be. The morning had started like any other in this godforsaken war. Coffee that tasted like burnt acorns, hardtack that could break teeth, and the endless waiting that came before every charge. Holden had been writing a letter to his sister Martha back in Lancaster when the first shells screamed overhead. He'd folded the half-finished page into his breast pocket, grabbed his Springfield, and followed Captain Morrison's whistle into hell. Now that whistle lay silent in the mud somewhere, along with Morrison himself and half the 23rd Pennsylvania. The Confederate line had held longer than anyone expected. What should have been a simple advance across open ground had turned into a slaughter that painted the earth red from the stone wall to the river's edge. "Stay with me, soldier." The voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Holden turned his head, blinking away blood and dirt, to see an angel kneeling beside him in the trench. At least, she looked like an angel, until you noticed the steel in her dark eyes and the way she moved with purpose that belonged to no heavenly being. Anais Covington had been working the field hospitals for 3 months now, ever since she'd arrived from Boston with a letter of introduction from the Ladies' Aid Society and a determination that surprised even the hardened army surgeons. She wore her brown hair pinned back severely, but strands always escaped to frame a face that belonged in drawing rooms, not battlefields. Her nurse's apron, once pristine white, now bore the stains of a dozen desperate mornings. "What's your name?" she asked, her hands already moving over his body with practiced efficiency. "Holden Baxter, ma'am. 23rd Pennsylvania." His words came out in gasps. The world kept tilting sideways, and he couldn't understand why the ground felt so warm beneath him. "Been fighting since Gettysburg." She followed his gaze downward, and he watched her face change, not with horror, as he'd expected, but with something fiercer. Determination. Her hands moved swiftly, tearing strips from her petticoat, binding what remained of his legs with a gentleness that made his chest ache worse than any wound. You can almost smell the iron in the air, thick and sweet, mingling with gunpowder smoke and the September morning's dew. Around them, other wounded men called out for water, for their mothers, for God's mercy. Some would receive all 3 before the day was done. Others would find only silence. "The river," Holden whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant crack of rifles. "Can you hear it?" The Rappahannock ran just beyond the ridge, its waters singing an ancient song beneath the percussion of battle. Confederate forces held the far bank, but rumor had it they were pulling back toward Richmond. If the Union could hold this ground, if they could reach that water, they'd have claimed something more precious than territory. They'd have won the kind of victory that mattered. "I hear it," Anais said, though her attention never wavered from her work. "Swift and clear today. The rain last week raised it some. My grandfather told me." Holden's voice faded as pain washed over him in waves. "Told me stories about the old country. Said victory tastes different when you drink it from the source, when you've earned it with your own blood." He tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "Sounds foolish now." She paused, her hands still on his makeshift bandages. Something in her expression shifted, as if she were seeing him for the first time, not just another broken soldier, but a man with dreams still burning behind his eyes despite everything the war had taken from him. "Then we'll get you to that river," she said simply. The words hung in the air between them like a vow. Around them, the battle had shifted. The Confederate line was indeed falling back, but slowly, grudgingly, making the Union pay for every yard of ground. Holden could see blue uniforms moving forward in ragged lines, stepping over the bodies of friends and enemies alike. A shell exploded 30 yards to their left, showering them with dirt and stones. Other nurses would have ducked, would have run for better cover. Anais never flinched. She gathered the corners of a canvas stretcher, probably torn from some poor soul's tent, and began working it beneath him with movements that spoke of strength. hidden beneath silk and whalebone. "Ma'am, you can't." Holden tried to protest, but the words dissolved into a groan as she shifted his weight. "The rebels still hold the Treeline. You'll be cut down before we make it halfway. Miss Covington, to you, soldier. And I can do whatever needs doing." Her voice carried the authority of someone born to drawing rooms, but forged in field hospitals. "Besides, what kind of nurse would I be if I let a patient die of thirst?" Through the haze of pain, Holden caught glimpses of her story in small details. The calluses on her palms that spoke of work no lady should know. The way she moved through the battlefield like she'd been born to it, despite the Boston accent that marked her as far from home. The locket at her throat that she touched whenever she thought no one was looking, gold, with initials he couldn't quite make out. She began to pull. The stretcher scraped against stones and roots, each jolt sending lightning through what remained of his body. But somehow, impossibly, they were moving toward the sound of water. The Rappahannock called to them like a siren's song, promising redemption to whoever could reach its banks. "Why?" he gasped between waves of agony. "Why risk yourself for a stranger?" Anais paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Around them, the battle raged on, but it felt distant now, muffled by their shared purpose. When she looked at him again, her eyes held depths he hadn't noticed before: pain, determination, and something that might have been hope. "Because," she said, "everyone deserves to taste their victory." What he didn't know was that Anais had her own reasons for needing that river, reasons that had nothing to do with his thirst and everything to do with the letter hidden in her medical bag, the one that would change everything if it ever reached the right hands. The stretcher lurched forward another few feet before Anais collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in sharp gasps that fogged the cool morning air. Holden twisted his head to study her face, noting the pale sheen of exhaustion beneath her determined expression. "Rest," he said quietly. "You've done enough." "I haven't done nearly enough." She wiped her palms on her already stained apron, leaving fresh streaks of his blood mixed with dirt. "And we're not stopping until you taste that victory water." Around them, the battlefield had taken on an eerie quality. The main fighting had moved east toward the Confederate fallback positions, leaving behind a landscape of scattered equipment and still forms that might have been sleeping if not for the unnatural angles of their limbs. Smoke drifted lazily across the field, carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder and something else, something sweet and terrible that Holden didn't want to name. "Tell me about Boston," he said, hoping to distract her from whatever memories were flickering behind her eyes. "What brought a lady like you to a place like this?" Anais resumed her grip on the stretcher handles, but didn't immediately begin pulling. Instead, she stared toward the river, where sunlight caught the water and threw it back in diamonds. "My brother," she said finally. "Gideon. He enlisted with the Massachusetts 54th 2 years ago. Colored Regiment." Her voice carried a note of pride mixed with something rawer. "He wrote to me about the field hospitals, about how the wounded suffered more from neglect than from their injuries. Said if the ladies back home could see what he'd seen." She trailed off, but Holden understood. The Massachusetts 54th had earned their reputation at Fort Wagner, charging into Confederate guns with the kind of courage that made grown men weep. They'd also suffered casualties that made Cemetery Ridge look like a Sunday picnic. "Is he?" Holden didn't finish the question. "Missing." The word came out flat, final. "Since Petersburg." No word, no confirmation. Just missing. She touched the locket at her throat again, and this time Holden caught a glimpse of the initials engraved there. "GC. I came south to find him." The hospitals were just convenient. A rifle cracked somewhere in the distance, followed by shouting. The Confederate retreat wasn't as orderly as it had first appeared. Pockets of resistance still held the wooded areas, and Union patrols were paying the price for assuming the field was theirs. Anais began pulling again, her movements more deliberate now. The stretcher scraped over a fallen log, and Holden gritted, his teeth against the jolt of pain that shot through his severed nerves. Strange how the body could still feel phantom sensations in limbs that no longer existed. "What about you?" she asked, her voice slightly strained from the effort. "What's waiting for you back in Pennsylvania?" "A farm." The answer came automatically, though it felt like describing someone else's life. 40 acres of the prettiest land you ever saw. Apple orchards, Wheat fields, a creek that runs clear even in summer. He paused, remembering mornings when the mist rose off those fields like something out of a fairy tale. My sister Martha keeps it running while I'm gone. She's stronger than most men I know. And after the war, Holden laughed, but there was no humor in it. After the war? Miss Covington, look at me. What use is a farmer who can't walk his own fields? She stopped pulling so abruptly that the stretcher jerked, sending another wave of agony through his body. When she turned to face him, her eyes blazed with an intensity that made him shrink back. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Don't you dare give up before you've even tried. I've seen men with worse injuries than yours learn to live again, to work again, to love again." Love. The word escaped him before he could stop it. Color rose in her cheeks, but she held his gaze. "Yes, love. You think a woman cares more about a man's legs than his heart, than his courage?" She gestured toward the battlefield around them. "You charged Confederate guns this morning. You bled for something you believed in. That's the measure of a man, not whether he can dance at a harvest festival." Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, or the first stirring of something neither had expected to find in this place of death and sorrow. Holden found himself studying the curve of her lips, the way her hair caught, the light, the graceful strength in her hands as she gripped the stretcher handles. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked softly. "And don't tell me it's just about being a good nurse." Anais was quiet for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. Around them, the sounds of battle grew more distant. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with lazy grace, indifferent to the human drama below. "Because," she said finally, "I need to believe that good things can still happen, that people can still be saved." She touched her medical bag, where something crinkled like paper. "I've seen too much death, too much suffering. I need to know that sometimes, just sometimes, the story doesn't end with loss." Before he could respond, a new sound reached them, the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats approaching fast. Anais spun toward the noise, her hand instinctively moving to the small pistol tucked into her apron pocket. Through the drifting smoke came a lone rider, bent low over his horse's neck, blue uniform torn and bloodied. The rider spotted them and changed course, reining in hard beside their makeshift stretcher. It was a young Lieutenant Holden didn't recognize, his face blackened with powder burns. "Ma'am," the lieutenant gasped, "you need to get clear of this area. Confederate cavalry's flanking around through Miller's Woods. They'll be here within the hour." Anais looked from the lieutenant to Holden to the river that still lay 40 yards away, its waters singing their ancient song of victory and redemption. The choice hung before them like a blade: safety in retreat, or the fulfillment of a promise that might cost them both their lives. "How long do we have?" she asked. The lieutenant's answer would change everything. But first, he had to survive. Long enough to give it, because in the tree line behind him, a glint of metal caught the morning sun, and someone was taking very careful aim. The rifle shot cracked across the morning air like a whip, and the young lieutenant pitched forward from his saddle, crimson blooming across his chest. His horse reared, eyes rolling white with terror, before bolting toward the Union lines with stirrups flapping empty. Down. Anais threw herself across Holden's body as a second shot splintered the ground where she'd been standing. Through the acrid smoke, shapes moved in the tree line, gray uniforms, at least a dozen of them, advancing with the methodical patience of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Holden's hand found the pistol at his hip, though his fingers shook as he drew it. 6 shots against 12 men, and him flat on his back like a turtle flipped in the sun. The mathematics of survival had never looked bleaker. "Can you shoot?" Anais asked, her own weapon already in her hand. Up close, Holden could see it was a Navy Colt, its brass fittings polished to a golden gleam. Not the kind of gun a Boston lady should know how to use. "Well enough." He tried to keep his voice steady. "Though I'm better with a rifle. We work with what we have." Her eyes never left the approaching Confederates. "On my count, we make for that fallen oak 10 yards ahead. I'll pull, you cover our backs." "Miss Covington, that's madness. You'll be killed." She turned to look at him then, and he saw something in her face that made his breath catch. Not fear, though fear was certainly there. Not desperation, though they had cause enough for that. What he saw was a kind of fierce joy, as if she'd been waiting her whole life for a moment that demanded everything she had to give. Maybe, she said simply, but we'll die trying to reach that river, not cowering in the mud. The Confederate skirmishers had spread out in a loose line, moving from tree to tree with practiced stealth. Their leader, a grizzled sergeant with 3 stripes on his sleeve, raised his hand in a silent signal. They were close enough now that Holden could see the tobacco stains in his beard, the careful way he placed each bootfall to avoid snapping. Twigs. Now, Anais whispered. She lurched upright and began dragging the stretcher with strength that seemed impossible for her slender frame. Holden twisted onto his side and squeezed off 2 quick shots, more to buy time than with any hope of hitting anything. The Confederates scattered for cover, their disciplined advance dissolving into chaos. The 10 yards to the fallen oak felt like 10 miles. Each jolt of the stretcher sent lightning through Holden's ruined legs, but he kept firing. 3 shots. 4 or 5. His 6th and final bullet caught one of the gray-clad soldiers in the shoulder, spinning him around with a curse that would have made a sailor blush. They reached the oak just as return fire began crackling around them. Bark exploded in splinters above their heads, and Anais pressed herself flat against the massive trunk, her chest heaving with exertion. "Reload," she said, tossing him a cartridge box she'd somehow produced from her medical bag. "I'll keep them. Honest." She rose just enough to sight over the log and fired 3 measured shots. Each one found its mark, not killing shots, but enough to keep the Confederates pinned down while Holden fumbled fresh cartridges into his cylinder with fingers slick with blood and sweat. "You're full of surprises," he said, snapping the pistol. Closed. "My father believed daughters should be prepared for anything." Another shot, another gray uniform diving for cover. "He taught me to shoot, to ride, to keep accounts. Said the world was changing and women would need more than embroidery skills to survive it." A new voice cut through the gunfire, harsh, commanding, with the flat vowels of Alabama or Mississippi. "Y'all on the log. We got you surrounded. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody else needs to get hurt." Anais looked at Holden, a question in her eyes. The river was still 30 yards away, but they could hear it clearly now, that eternal murmur of water over stone that had called to them across the battlefield. So close, yet it might as well have been on the moon. "What do you think?" she asked quietly. "I think," Holden said, checking his loads one final time, "that I didn't come this far to surrender 20 yards short of victory." Before she could respond, something rustled in her medical bag. She reached inside and withdrew a folded letter, its edges worn soft from handling. The paper was expensive, the kind used for important correspondence, and sealed with red wax. That bore an official-looking impression. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of approaching footsteps. "About why I really need to reach that river." Holden stared at the letter, recognition dawning like sunrise after the longest night. "That's not a personal correspondence, is it?" "Intelligence." The word fell between them like a stone into still water. "Troop movements, supply lines, Confederate positions, all the way to Richmond. I was supposed to get it to General Meade's staff 3 days ago, but the field hospital." She shook her head. "I couldn't leave the wounded. Couldn't abandon my duty. And now there's a Union patrol on the far side of that river. I saw their signals this morning, before the battle started. If I can get this letter across." She tucked it back into her bag with careful precision. It could save thousands of lives. Could end this war months sooner. The footsteps were closer now, deliberate and unhurried. The Confederates knew they had time to be methodical. Holden found himself thinking of his sister Martha, probably working in the apple orchard right now, unaware that her brother lay bleeding beside a river in Virginia. He thought of all the other sisters, wives, mothers who would receive terrible news if that letter never reached friendly hands. "Well then," he said, managing something that almost resembled a smile, "I guess we'd better not disappoint them." But as the Confederate sergeant's shadow fell across their hiding place, neither of them saw the real threat approaching from the river itself, a threat that would force them to choose between the letter that could save thousands and the love that might save them both. The Confederate sergeant stepped into view with his rifle trained on Anais's heart, but his weathered face showed more weariness than hostility. Behind him, his men emerged from their concealment, boys mostly, their uniforms patched and repatched, their faces gaunt with the particular hunger that came from fighting a losing war on empty stomachs. Color. But this man needs water, and I mean to get it for him. Something shifted in the sergeant's expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or simple human decency asserting itself despite the circumstances. That water you're so keen on reaching, it ain't as empty as it looks. Before anyone could ask what he meant, the crack of rifle fire erupted from the riverbank. But these shots weren't aimed at them. Through the morning mist, muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly flowers along the Rappahannock's edge, and men in blue uniforms began falling like wheat before the scythe. Ambush, Holden breathed, understanding flooding through him like ice water. They're slaughtering the patrol. The Union soldiers had been watering their horses, refilling canteens, celebrating what they thought was a hard-won victory. Now they died with their guard down, cut to pieces by Confederate marksmen who'd been waiting in the tall grass on the far bank. The trap had been perfect, patient, and utterly without mercy. Anais watched the massacre with growing horror, her hand unconsciously moving to the letter in her medical bag. Those men, boys, really, some of them couldn't have been older than 16, had been her destination, her hope of getting vital intelligence to Union command. Now they were just bodies floating face down in water that ran red with their blood. Jesus, one of the Confederate soldiers whispered. Look at 'em all. The sergeant's jaw tightened, but he kept his rifle trained on Anais. War's a cruel business, son. Always has been. He looked back at her with something that might have been sympathy. I'm sorry you had to see that, ma'am. But maybe now you understand why we can't let you reach that water. You knew. The accusation in her voice cut through the morning air. Like a blade. You knew about the ambush. We knew enough. The sergeant's weathered face showed no emotion. Orders came down this morning. Let the Yanks think they'd won. Let him get comfortable. Then hit him where it hurts. He gestured toward the river with his rifle barrel. Reckon it worked. Holden felt the weight of his empty pistol in his hand and wished desperately for his grandfather's old hunting rifle, the one that could drop a deer at 200 yards. But wishes were for children and fools, and he was neither anymore. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now, the sergeant considered this. Well, normally I'd march you back to our lines, turn you over to intelligence. That letter in the lady's bag looks mighty important. Several of his men stirred at this, hands tightening on their weapons. But I got boys wounded too, and she's been treating Confederate casualties same as Union. That counts for something. Anais straightened, her chin lifting with familiar determination. Then let me go to them. Let me help your wounded, and we'll call it even. Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but his words were cut off by a sound that made every man on the field freeze, the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery. Somewhere to the east, Union batteries had finally gotten their range, and they were laying down covering fire for a counterattack. The first shell hit 50 yards away, geysering dirt and stones into the air. The second landed closer. The third would have killed them all if not for the fallen oak that absorbed most of the shrapnel. Move, the sergeant shouted to his men. Fall back to the secondary position. But as his soldiers began their retreat, a new threat emerged from the smoke and chaos. A lone figure stumbled from the riverbank. A Union soldier, wounded but still carrying his rifle, still fighting despite the blood streaming down his face. Behind him came another, then another. The patrol hadn't been completely wiped out after all. Anais. The wounded soldier's voice carried across the battlefield, raw with desperation and hope. Anais, is that you? She went rigid, her face draining of all color. The letter fell from nerveless fingers as she stared at the approaching figure, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark skin streaked with blood and river mud but unmistakably alive. Gideon, she whispered. Her brother reached them just as another artillery shell screamed overhead. Up close, Holden could see the family resemblance, the same determined jaw, the same fierce intelligence in dark eyes that had seen too much of war's cruelty. Gideon's uniform bore the insignia of the Massachusetts 54th, and his rifle never wavered as he took in the scene. His sister kneeling beside a wounded stranger, Confederate soldiers scattered in retreat, and the precious intelligence letter lying in the mud between them. The patrol's broken, Gideon said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and grief. Most of the boys are dead. But I saw your signal. Saw you heading for the water. His eyes found the letter, understanding immediately. Please tell me you still have it. Anais reached for the letter with shaking hands, but the Confederate sergeant was faster. His boot pinned the document to the ground as he swung his rifle toward Gideon. Can't let you take that, soldier, he said quietly. Nothing personal, but orders are orders. The moment stretched like a bowstring drawn to breaking. 3 weapons, 3 people, and a piece of paper that might determine how many more young men would die before winter came. Around them, the artillery barrage continued, each explosion bringing Union reinforcements closer to their position. Holden looked from Anais to her brother to the Confederate sergeant, all of them frozen in this tableau of war and family and impossible choices. Then he looked at the river, still singing its ancient song just yards away, and understood what victory really tasted like. It tasted like blood and sacrifice and the terrible mathematics of love. But before anyone could pull a trigger, the river itself would demand its price, and someone would have to choose between duty and devotion in the space of a single heartbeat. The choice hung in the air like smoke from a dying campfire, heavy with the weight of all the words that couldn't be spoken. Holden watched the 3 figures frozen in their deadly triangle. Anais reaching for the letter, her brother Gideon with his rifle trained on the Confederate sergeant, and the grizzled Southerner whose boots still pinned the intelligence to the muddy ground. Then the river made the choice for them. The morning's rain upstream had been heavier than anyone realized, and the Rappahannock was rising fast. What had been a gentle murmur became a roar as the swollen waters burst their banks, sweeping away the dead from both sides, claiming weapons and dreams and the bitter mathematics of war with equal indifference. Move, Gideon shouted as the flood surged toward them. Higher ground. The Confederate sergeant looked down at the letter beneath his boot, then at the wall of brown water bearing down on them, like judgment itself. In that instant, something passed across his weathered features. Not surrender, exactly, but recognition of forces greater than human conflict. He stepped back. Take it, he said to Anais, his voice barely audible above the rushing water. Get your intelligence to whoever needs it. This war's cost enough young lives already. Anais snatched the letter from the mud just as the flood reached them. The stretcher began to float, and suddenly Holden found himself riding the current like a leaf on a mill stream. Anais clinging to one end while her brother waited alongside, using his rifle as a makeshift pole to guide their passage. The Confederate soldiers scattered for higher ground, their retreat turning into a race against the rising water. The sergeant paused on a small hillock, touched his hat to Anais one final time, then melted into the smoke with his men like ghosts from some half-remembered dream. Hold on, Gideon called out as they swept past the drowned battlefield. Bodies floated around them, Union and Confederate alike, their quarrels silenced by the water's ancient authority. Holden closed his eyes and tried not to think about how easily he could join them, how simple it would be to let go and sink beneath the surface where pain couldn't follow. But Anais's hand found his, her fingers interlacing with his own. And suddenly letting go was the last thing he wanted to do. The flood carried them downstream for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, until the current finally deposited them on a muddy bank where Union cavalry waited with fresh horses and grim faces. A young captain with Missouri markings helped pull them from the water while his men secured the area. Miss Covington. The captain's voice carried the particular relief of someone who'd been searching for days. General Meade's been expecting your report. She handed over the letter with fingers that still shook from cold and exhaustion. Tell the general. Tell him the intelligence is 3 days old, but the Confederate positions should still be accurate. They're falling back toward Richmond, but slowly. And Captain, she looked back toward the flooded battlefield where so many had died. Tell him the cost was higher than it needed to be. The captain nodded and spurred his horse toward the Union lines, the precious letter secured in his saddlebags. Within hours, it would be in the right hands. Within days, the information might save hundreds of lives, might shorten the war by weeks or months. But right now, all that mattered was the weight of Anais's hand in his and the sound of water flowing past them toward the sea. You did it, Holden said quietly. You got me to the river. She looked down at him, her hair plastered to her skull, her dress torn and muddy, more beautiful than any woman had a right to be after what they'd endured. We did it, she corrected. Together. Gideon knelt beside them, his own wounds forgotten in the moment. The doctors at the field hospital, they'll take good care of you, Holden. I've seen men with worse injuries learn to walk again, learn to live again. And after? Holden asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Anais cupped muddy water in her palms and held it to his lips. It tasted of earth and rain and something indefinable. Victory, perhaps, or simply the promise of tomorrow. After, she said, you're going to teach me about apple orchards and wheat fields and creeks that run clear even in summer. And I'm going to teach you that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible. He drank from her hands, the water cool and sweet against his parched throat. Around them, the war continued, distant thunder of cannon fire, the crack of rifle shots, the eternal sound of young men dying for causes they barely understood. But here, in this small pocket of peace beside a river that had carried them through hell, something new was beginning. The taste, Holden whispered, remembering his grandfather's words. It's different when you've earned it. Yes, Anais agreed, her thumb brushing a drop of water from his chin. It tastes like hope. 3 months later, in a field hospital in Washington, Holden Baxter would take his first halting steps on wooden legs carved by a German craftsman who understood that some wounds could be mended, even if they couldn't be erased. 6 months after that, he would marry Anais Covington in a small ceremony attended by her brother Gideon and a handful of soldiers who'd learned that love was the only victory that really mattered. And years later, when grandchildren gathered around their hearth in Pennsylvania, they would tell the story of how grandmother carried grandfather to the river so he could taste victory water, and how sometimes, if you listened closely on quiet summer evenings, you could still hear that ancient song flowing through their words, carrying the promise that some things endure long after the battles end and the young men come home. The war would end the following spring, but their story was just beginning. If this tale of courage and devotion moved your heart, strike that like button harder than Union artillery at Cemetery Ridge. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever carried someone toward their victory, even when the path seemed impossible? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love triumphant over the darkest chapters of our past. Now, tell us in the comments, where in this wide world are you watching from today?